Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Know Your Rights While Protesting training presented by the ACLU of Kansas. Today, we'll cover what you need to know to exercise your First Amendment right to assemble and express your views through protest. Before we dive in, here's a quick overview of what we'll be covering today. The training will cover guidance about protesting during COVID and cover several subjects related to your right to protest, such as your rights relating to organizing and attending a protest, filming or photographing the police, what to do if you've been stopped or detained by the police, as well as providing additional helpful information and the risks associated with protesting. Okay, so let's jump right in. Here's a reminder that, as I'm sure you all very well know at this point, we are in a global pandemic. This has changed the way that we protest, and we have to take a few more precautions than we otherwise would. The ACLU of Kansas would like to note that protesting is a personal choice and that the ACLU of Kansas is not encouraging individuals to attend in-person gatherings. But if you do, please make the choice to protest safely by following CDC guidelines, such as getting vaccinated, wearing a mask, keeping a distance of at least 6 feet between yourself and others, utilizing hand sanitizer if you're unable to frequently wash your hands, quarantining for 14 days following close interaction with others, and if you happen to develop any COVID symptoms, such as a fever, getting tested and contacting anyone you have been in physical contact with at or since the time of the protest. All right, so let's get into it. In this slide, we'll cover a frequently asked question, whether or not you need a permit. The answer to this largely depends on the location in which you plan to protest. You do not need a permit to march in the streets or on sidewalks. However, you should obey traffic signals. It's also important to recognize that there may be safety concerns should you choose to protest in a street that is not blocked off. Certain events may require a permit, for example, events that include marches or parades, or even events that use sound amplifying devices, so plan accordingly. Also note that the normal permit procedures do not apply for protests in response to breaking news events. So what exactly does this look like? Think about the folks in Minnesota during the summer of 2020 who were mobilizing to protest the murder of George Floyd, as a brief example. Let's talk a little bit more about permit rules here before we move on. If you receive a permit and it contains restrictions, such as on the route of the march or on sound equipment that you are planning to use, please let us know so that we can look into it. This may be an infringement on your First Amendment rights, and our office wants to be aware of potential violations. Also note that your permit cannot be denied because your event might be deemed as controversial or seem controversial. Lastly, you may be asked to pay a fee. We'll talk about this more in depth later in the training, but if you cannot afford that fee, the fee should be waived. You should have an equal opportunity to exercise your First Amendment rights. Again, if you run into this issue or have any problems, please contact the ACLU of Kansas. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit to where you can protest. Whether you are considering attending your very first protest or you're a seasoned activist, it is always important to brush up on where constitutionally protected protest activity can take place. The Supreme Court has distinguished traditional public fora as the place where protesters have the strongest rights. Traditional public forums include sidewalks, streets, and parks. On private property, things get a little trickier. It's best not to protest here unless you have permission from the property owner. Government buildings are even trickier, so typically try to stick to the traditional public fora. And as a quick note, as someone who's helped organize protests, now seems like a great time to mention that if you are attending a protest, you should consider writing an emergency contact, or even better, your attorney's phone number on your arm with a permanent marker. That way, if you happen to be arrested, you have somebody to call to bail you out. All right, so let's briefly talk about Senate Bill 172. Kansas has passed legislation allowing the right to peacefully protest for all Kansans while also protecting the critical infrastructure in the state. Examples of a critical infrastructure facility include petroleum refineries, electric generation facilities, chemical, polymer, or rubber manufacturing facilities, water treatment facilities, railroad tracks or other freight facilities, federally licensed radio or television stations, and a few other places. So be sure to check out SB 172 to make sure that you are not planning a protest on a CIF and for the full list of what qualifies as a CIF. On this next slide, let's cover a few additional points about attending a protest. It's important to remember that counter protesters also have free speech rights. However, the police should be treating you equally. You should be allowed to be within sight and sound of one another. This is also a good place to mention it's a good idea to have a plan in place in the event that things escalate. We'll touch on this a bit more later, but you do have the right to photograph anything in plain view when you're in a public space. And just like before, it gets a little trickier when you're dealing with private property. As we move on to this next slide, we'll briefly discuss what type of speech is protected under the Constitution. The First Amendment protects all political speech. The government cannot censor you because your speech is unpopular. However, the government can censor you if your speech incites violence or is law-breaking. On this next slide here, we'll cover a scenario that you might find yourself in at a protest, and that is what happens if the police issue an order to disperse. The police cannot break up a gathering unless there's a clear and present danger to public safety. If the police do issue a dispersal order, they have to give you ample time to get out of there, meaning two things. The dispersal order must detail when and how protesters should disperse, as well as what will happen if you fail to disperse, and the police should provide sufficient time and opportunity for protesters to leave. If you do not leave, know that you could be arrested. And this, again, is why it's important to have that phone number written on your arm. In the next few slides, the training will turn its attention to photographing and filming police. If you recall from earlier in the training, you do have the right to photograph or video in public spaces. The police cannot take your phone or recording device without a warrant. The US Supreme Court has held that police must have a warrant to confiscate and view your digital photographs that are contained on your phone. So if they ask you to do this, you're going to tell them to get a warrant. However, if the police think you're interfering in some way, they can ask you to stop. For example, if you're filming an arrest and are in close proximity, the law enforcement officer may ask you to take a step back. Let's shift gears to the issue of knowing what to do if you're stopped or detained for taking photos or filming, as this is a key component to knowing your rights as a protester. The number one thing to do is remain calm and to not resist. You are free to mention that you are not disrupting anyone else's activities and that the First Amendment protects your actions. Next, ask if you're free to leave, and if the answer is yes, calmly walk away. If you are under arrest or being detained, you have a right to ask why. This is also a good place to briefly talk about jail support. If you're organizing a protest, or even if you're responding to a protest, consider setting up jail support procedures. Having a bail fund on standby, creating a survey to gather personal information and contact information of protesters in the event that someone's arrested, reaching out to local attorneys who can work to bail out and represent protesters at later hearings is very important. Note that you should be housing this information securely somewhere, either encrypted or password protected. Proactive action like this will go a long way when things start to heat up on the ground. If you're interested in learning more about jail support options, please reach out to the ACLU of Kansas to discuss our Legal Observer program. Here, let's discuss protecting the content and data on your phone. If you record on your phone, make sure to upload to a secure cloud as soon as you are able. Be sure to turn off facial recognition and Touch ID, and lock your phone with at least a 6-digit passcode. And lastly, make sure your phone locks immediately. Here's why this is important. If you are arrested and your phone is unlocked, you run the risk of people seeing and potentially deleting recordings you may have made. While police should not go through your phone, let's be real, the police do a lot of things they shouldn't do. So make sure to take these precautions before you make your way to the protest or as soon as you arrive. All right, so in the event that you are stopped by the police by protesting, it's important to remain calm. Make sure to keep your hands visible. Don't argue, resist, or obstruct the police, even if you believe they are violating your rights. Calmly point out that you are not disrupting anyone else's activity and that the First Amendment protects your actions. and ask if you're free to leave. If the officer says yes, calmly walk away. And here's also where it's helpful to have that list of protesters we mentioned earlier. Let's say someone gets arrested and they're attending the protest alone. If you have their information on hand and a person to contact on their behalf, when this person is getting arrested, all they need to do is tell someone who's not getting arrested their name so it can be accessed in the database, and you can expedite the bailout process by calling their person of contact to arrange pickup and bail if you don't already have a bail fund in place. If police ask to search you or your belongings, what should you say? No, absolutely not. Every single time, say no. Please remember that you are never required to consent to a search of you or your belongings. If you do explicitly consent, it can affect you later in court. It is so important to remember this rule, even if you feel like you have nothing to hide. The police may still pat you down, which they are allowed to do if they believe you are carrying a weapon or immediately recognizable drugs. So leave all of that at home. And here's another reminder that police cannot confiscate or demand to review recordings you have made without a warrant. The police also cannot tell you to delete your data under any circumstances. Okay, we're going to make this slide interactive because it is so important. This slide truly is of the utmost importance because it extends beyond the confines of protesting into any interaction with the police in which you may be getting arrested. If you are arrested, there are two things you should always say. So I'm going to have you repeat after me. Number one, I want my lawyer. And number two, I am invoking my right to silence. After you've said these two things, do not speak, not a word. Police are notorious for trying to work around an invocation of silence, but once you have said that to them, you don't have to talk to them anymore, and they're supposed to leave you alone. And when I say don't speak, I mean not to anyone, not to cellmates, not in an empty room. It is of the utmost importance to unequivocally invoke that right to silence and then actually remain silent. And seriously, do not sign anything without your attorney present. As we move on to the next slide, let's turn our attention to information that you need to know if you believe your rights have been violated. Making the decision to file a written complaint with an agency's internal affairs division or a local civilian complaint board, or even pursuing legal action, requires that the event be taken seriously. Be prepared to document the event the best that you can. Because you'll want to provide as much evidence as possible, it is important to write down and record everything you can, including the officer's badge number, the patrol car number, and the agency they work for. If possible, get contact information from witnesses and take photographs of any injuries that were sustained. Before filing your complaint, you may also want to seek legal advice. Let's now turn to some other helpful information when it comes to protesting. On this slide, we're going to discuss your right to distribute leaflets and other literature on public sidewalks. Let it be known that you do have the right to approach pedestrians on public sidewalks for things like leaflets, flyers, newspapers, and petitions. You can also solicit for donations without a permit. You can even set up a table, although you may need a permit to do so, as long as you're not blocking any entrances and you're not harassing passersby. On our next slide, let's discuss your rights to picket on public sidewalks. Again, here it is important to remember that pedestrians and other people occupying the sidewalks can pass by you and that no entrances to buildings are blocked. Let's spend a little bit more time discussing fees for First Amendment activity. You may be asked to pay an application fee or security deposit. If you feel you're being targeted with excessive fees because of the nature of your event, for example, if it's deemed controversial, please contact us or other legal counsel. Also, regulations with financial requirements should include a waiver for groups that cannot afford the charge, so that even grassroots organizations can exercise their free speech rights. Therefore, a group without significant financial resources should not be prevented from engaging in a march simply because it cannot afford the charges the city would like to impose. As we move to our next set of slides, we will shift gears to discuss the risks associated with attending a protest. Let's begin by discussing risks that non-citizens and undocumented people may encounter. ICE, Border Patrol, and the Department of Homeland Security have surveilled and investigated non-citizen activists for participation in protests, and in some cases, this has led to adverse immigration consequences. Surveillance may consist of, but is not limited to, social media monitoring, the use of facial recognition, automatic license plate readers, and surveillance cameras. People that are undocumented face a risk when there is any interaction with law enforcement because that interaction could lead to an ICE encounter, even if you did not commit a crime and there are no charges for a crime. People that are undocumented may also face retaliation if, for example, they are protesting working conditions of their employment. Immigrants and non-citizens with documentation should be aware that if you're convicted in court for an offense that you are accused of committing while protesting, that conviction can have immigration consequences, including potential deportation. On this slide, let's discuss what you should do if law enforcement asks about your immigration status. First, stay calm. Don't run, argue, resist, or obstruct the officer, even if you believe your rights are being violated. Do not lie about the status or provide false documents. You do not, I repeat, you do not have to discuss your immigration status with police, immigration agents, or other officials. You have the right to remain silent. However, if you are not a US citizen and the immigration agent requests your immigration papers, you must show them if you have them with you. Don't forget that if an immigration agent asks if they can search you, you have the right to say no. And remember, you have the right to consult a lawyer before answering any questions. In some jurisdictions, police have shown up at protests with the purpose of identifying and arresting people with warrants. If you have an active warrant, you should be aware that this could happen to you and take precautions accordingly. Police may use equipment such as automatic license plate readers and stingrays, sometimes known as ISMI catchers or cell site simulators, or even facial recognition technology. The police may also be using video and photographs of protests that are posted to social media to look for evidence of criminal activity, which can then be used to issue a warrant for your arrest. It is strongly encouraged that you learn more about these invasive surveillance technologies that might be recording you, your friends, and your family during a protest. Please take some time to check out the link on this slide. It is important that this training recognizes the systemic racism in the institution of policing and law enforcement. But as people take to the streets to demand justice and shine a light on systemic racism, their calls are being met by violence and unconstitutional law enforcement attacks. The unfortunate reality is that Black people are often targeted by police at protests. It is really important to take precautions such as filming police interactions and letting a friend or family member know when you arrive at a protest and when you have safely returned home or to a safe place after the protest. Black organizers and activists have long faced retaliation and surveillance from law enforcement for their participation in protests and demonstrations. If you feel that you are being retaliated against or being surveilled by the police, do your best to document the occurrences and seek legal advice. As we close out our training, let's cover the risks associated with protesting as a minor. Outside of school, students enjoy essentially the same rights to protest and speak out as anyone else. It's nearly impossible for the government to silence you outside of your school time and off of school property if you are protesting in traditional public fora. This concludes this edition of the Know Your Rights training provided by the ACLU of Kansas. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope the information provided is a helpful tool to help you exercise and protect your First Amendment rights. We hope to have you back soon for another training. In the meantime, check out aclukansas.org for updates and more information. Be safe out there.